Welcome to Dystopia Today. It is Thursday, May 27th, and we are documenting democracy's dysfunction. I'm Libby Emmons, editor with The Post Millennial, and I'm here with Brian Edward, director of Myth-Informed. And why don't we just get right to it?
Yeah.
This week, there was a lot of crazy stuff going on with critical race theory. We see this coming up more and more. And there was something really interesting that we saw this week that reminded me of back in the old days when I used to make art all the time. I used to be a theater artist. And there are concepts that we see emerging now with critical race theory, ideas about oppression theory, identity politics, were all coming up way before they hit the rest of culture. And they were coming up in the arts. I was in the downtown indie theater scene, and there was an awful lot of this going on. I would say starting in probably the mid noughties, something around
Is that what they call them now?
2004-ish.
What? The aughties, the naughties? I like that.
The naughties,
Okay.
the naughties. And at a certain point, I remember hearing this idea in art circles that white people should sit down with their whiteness. And so I was a theater artist. I wanted to do the right thing. So I did this. I sat down with my whiteness. I gave it some thought. And in so doing, I actually came up with very similar ideas as Christopher Rufo has. Just this past week, he was talking to Mark Lamont Hill, and Rufo is asked by Hill, "What do you like about being white?" And he really takes a moment to this question. Seems a little pointed. Sean, could you play that video?
And if I were to say to you right now, Christopher, what do you like about being white? What would you say?
I don't know. Again, it's such an amorphous term. It's like a census term or a
but can you do me a favor? Indulge me for one. Just we're running out of time. Indulge me for a minute. I understand you see it as all these things, but you surely recognize that the world sees you as white. You know the world reads you as white. And if you were to ask me some things I like about being black, I could talk about cultural norms. I could talk about tradition. I could talk about the kind of commonalities I feel around the diaspora. If I were to ask you what, particularly if you're saying whiteness is a thing that is being constructed as negative and shouldn't be, name something positive that you like about being white.
Okay, we can cut it there.
Well, sure. I'll
we
answer.
We can cut it there. Libby,
so,
why is Chris laughing?
Yeah, that struck me too. And it's so interesting because the question itself, what do you like about being white, is completely and utterly disingenuous, because there is nothing culturally positive about the perceived culture of whiteness. In Europe, white people are just from whatever European nation their families are from. But in the US, white people are white with no national origin or background culture, right? I mean, there is no real, for the most part, white people in the US whose families came from Europe are cut off from that culture for whatever reason, assimilation primarily. You become American, you stop thinking too much about the old world, right? So my ancestors, my most recent immigrant ancestors, have been here for over 100 years. I don't feel Norwegian in the slightest. I don't feel like I'm Italian. My grandmother taught me how to make Italian American dishes. And her mother used to always say, like, eat the sausages, you're too thin, whatever. And the broccoli and the broccolinis and the peppers and whatever. So that was a thing. There's a lot of food associated with it, but there's no real cultural heritage there. If anything, I feel like my family is from New York and New England, which, it primarily is. The last big wave of European immigration into the US was about 100 years ago. The white culture of the Mayflower has long since receded into the history books, which is totally fine. I mean, that's not a judgment. That's just, a thing. It's just what happened. So the concept of whiteness at this point in America is entirely about, the culpability of whiteness for white sins. So the correct answer, the only real answer to what do you like about being white, is nothing. There's nothing to like about being white. I can't think of a single thing that I like about myself that has to do with, the color of my skin or this perceived culture of whiteness, which I don't think I could personally define.
Yeah.
And Rufo is right when he says that he rejects the categorization. And the end of that, at the end of that short clip, he says that he thinks of himself as an individual human being. And when he suggests that he hopes that he and Hill can view each other without regard to race, but on their own individuality, Hill basically says that Rufo's ask for that is rooted in white privilege. That the only way that Rufo can say, let's just view each other as men, as individuals, as human beings, is because of his whiteness, which there isn't anything to like about.
Right.
There isn't anything about it that is, even from my perspective, definitive. And what's interesting is that we have a situation, I know I just keep talking over you and I apologize, but we have a situation where whiteness as a culture is perceived of as that culture only really by people outside of that culture who look at it and say, this is a giant block of culture. The people inside that culture look around and they're like, I don't see what you see. I don't see this thing that is some sort of unification of all the people that have the same skin color that they have in common. But even to say that you don't see it is evidence of some sort of white supremacist notion.
Yeah.
So it's really sort of a fascinating dichotomy, like where we've landed with this thing.
Personally, I think it's a trap. Like that anything he would have answered in any positive way would have been considered white privilege, personally.
Or just white pride. I mean, and there's nothing, that's absurd. The absurdity of this idea that there would be something you like about whiteness, because all that would be construed as is taking pride in your white culture, which we know is a total garbage concept. Yeah. We know that from forever. You know, we know that from the entire 20th century. This is not only is it not a thing to do, it's not a thing that is possible to do, because there is not that kind of, you know, similarity.
That's a good point. Like, but there is, he mentions 3 different like points of Black identity and 3 different things he likes about Black identity, because there's something real to that. You know, whether you like it or not, whether you think it should be a thing or not, yeah, there is something real to it. But there isn't a white identity, not a positive one.
Right, but there's a difference too between a Black identity or an identity where you take into consideration your culture that is based on race in the U.S. if you're a Black person, right? Because it's a minority as well. So there's like, I don't know. I mean, I'm not a Black person, obviously, but it's like in a minority culture. If we look at other minority cultures, there are more similarities in parades and things like that. I mean, even if you look in New York at the Columbus Day Parade, which was traditionally an Italian American parade, although this year I think it's being renamed to like Indigenous Peoples Day officially.
Oh, is it?
Yeah,
which is so weird.
You know, Italian pride in Columbus is not considered to be a reasonable thing. And there aren't enough people that identify as Italian at this point anyway.
I feel it's just so ironic that the reason why we wrote Christopher Columbus and made Columbus Day was actually an attempt to reduce racism, anti-Italian racism against Americans. So we write Christopher Columbus, who's actually Genoan, and we call him Italian, and then we write him into the books, and then, maybe, like, it's ironic that it was, we're crapping on a person or a statue that was an attempted anti-racism from the 1920s. So.
Yeah, it was an attempt at inclusivity.
Mm-hmm. It was.
And now we're saying, and you know, maybe we don't need that anymore.
Maybe it's time's up, yeah.
Because maybe the Italians are totally included now, which is totally fine. I mean, no judgment on that.
Right.
But that is sort of an interesting, switch. I learned today, in fact, that in Canada, in World War II, I wonder if you knew this, they had internment camps for Italians as well as Japanese.
I did not know that. I didn't
either. I learned that today. Roberto Wakerell Cruz, our Canadian news editor at the Post Millennial, was telling me all about it. And I was stunned. I really had no idea.
Yeah, those warmongering, brutal Italians.
More racist. Yeah, I couldn't decide if that was more racist or less racist than only interning Japanese people.
Yeah, well,
I think it might be less racist, but more xenophobic.
It could be. I mean, I think it was so hard to tell German Americans, like in the United States. They said every captured POW, Nazi POW, had told their American captors that they had a cousin that lived in Milwaukee.
Well, probably they did, right?
They probably did. We still have German newspapers here.
Right. You took me to that German restaurant when I was out there.
That's true.
That was quite a lot of, I don't even know what it was. It was a lot of pork is what it was.
So I heard you had a beef with the Constitution.
Yeah. So it wasn't me. It wasn't me that had a beef with the Constitution. Sean, you could pull up that article as well, if you like. It's an article about a stream that I recently watched of a Los Angeles high school teacher who was talking to 3 critical race theorists as they were trying to find some sort of common ground, starting point for a conversation. All 4 of them work in education. And when Will Roush, who was the teacher who also works with the Heterodox Academy for K through 12, when he tried to cite Enlightenment principles as perhaps a jumping off point where they could all agree on what the appropriate path forward in culture was to attain more equality and liberty and all of that, Kate Doran, who said early on in the video that she identifies as Basque and is getting more in touch with her Basque heritage and culture, she said that the Enlightenment was basically garbage and that the Constitution needed to be burned. Sean, do you want to pull that clip up? You can take a look at it.
So I just want to jump in and bring it back to the point. For anyone who doesn't know what Enlightenment principles are, it's a philosophical movement that dominated in Europe during the 18th century, was centered around the idea that reason is the primary source of authority and legitimacy, and advocated such ideals as liberty, progress, tolerance, fraternity, constitutional government, and separations of church and state. Now, inherently, the problem with that is that when our Constitution was built on those founding principles, but was not built on those founding principles, including the humanization of marginalized folks. So you cannot cite our Constitution. Our Constitution should be burned because our Constitution in and of itself is only written for who owned land? Men at the time. It's still written accordingly. Who was owned? Black folks. Those amendments have not been ratified. You should read your Constitution. If you're going to actually make these references, then you should know what you're talking about. There are still really oppressive amendments and languaging in our Constitution that are inherently
13th Amendment.
Which means the Constitution itself is only rooted in enlightenment for white people, just like this country. So,
the 13th Amendment, isn't that the one that abolished slavery?
Yeah, that is the amendment that abolished slavery. Perhaps they're taking issue with the 13th Amendment because it says that people can be forced to work if they are imprisoned, and it's part of their punishment after they've been duly convicted. But yes, the 13th Amendment is the one that abolished slavery, and apparently the Constitution should be burned. How are you supposed to have a discourse with someone about how to further the goals of the United States if they think the goals of the United States are trash in the first place?
Yeah.
And Doran wasn't the only one to feel this way on the call. There was another woman, Dr. Kate Slater, who has worked in teacher recruitment as well. And she took the opportunity to say in that same stream that by virtue of that historical grounding, whiteness represents white guilt, white fragility, white supremacy, white violence. All of these things are now synonymous with whiteness, which I see as a stand-in for white supremacy. So we have Mark Lamont Hill asking Chris Rufo what he likes about being white. And we have a critical race theorist, Dr. Slater, saying that whiteness represents white guilt, white fragility, white supremacy, white violence, that these things are synonymous with whiteness, and that whiteness is a stand-in for white supremacy. So asking someone what they like about being white is basically saying, it's basically an invitation to say, I'm this horrible person. So what kind of thing is that? To create a situation where a culture is supposedly based on the legacy of a skin color in a nation, and to demand that people identify with that, and to then say that the identification with that is already on its face, basically a human rights violation.
It is. And isn't it also an identity violation? Like, I hear often, and the point is made that, white and black was a social construct made in the 1650s to justify racism. Black people were taken across the Atlantic to be slaved, and then were foisted with the identity black, right? They weren't allowed to practice the religions. They had to learn English. They had to they get rid of all their other culture, and then they said, now you're black. So this has long been the argument, like Eric Dyson made. And he said, this wasn't an identity I picked. It was foisted upon me. And I'm like, he's got a point there. Like, I get that. That wasn't an identity you picked. But aren't they doing that to us? Like with Mark Lamont Hill, or in this case, why do I have to identify with my race? What if I don't wish to? Isn't this an identity being foisted on me in an awfully negative one?
Well, it's sort of interesting, I think, because the ask is to sit down with your whiteness and figure out what that means. The assumption is that if you don't identify as white, that's a problem. But to identify as white is to identify with something that is a racist. It like basically means that you're racist if you identify with it. So it's kind of weird. But Slater is actually now in the administration at Brandeis University. And she is basically telling kids there that whiteness and white supremacy are the same thing.
Yeah.
And I think you took a look at this, didn't you?
She did. Right. So when we were like looking at all of this, we both came up with Kate Slater. And the question I wanted to ask you is, how much would you pay for a 4-year indoctrination into Maoism?
Well, I did go to Columbia University, so rather a lot, it turns out.
Well, so if you said $230,444, you are correct, because that according to Wikipedia, or a quick Google search, that was the price times for Brandeis. So, Sean, could we get up to pull up the video here? But Brandeis, so Kate Slater says, all white people act in racist and white supremacist ways dozens of times a day. Sean, could we play that?
I mess up frequently. I say things that are racist. I say things that are racially coded. I do things that cause harm, and I'm going to continue to. And that is because I am a white person living in a racist society. And I think, again, the more that white people can really practice, and I don't mean to extend a practice, there's an urgency and a necessity to doing this work. This is racial justice. The more that we can wrap our heads around the fact that we act in racist and white supremacist ways a dozen times a day without even being aware of it, that's when we can begin to really begin to deconstruct what that means and unpack what that means in the service of liberation, in the service.
Yeah.
I mess up frequently.
Remember, this is a dean of a college in the United States in Massachusetts, and this is Maoist. This is a struggle session. Like, she's doing this one voluntarily, but absolutely, this is terrible. And like, have you ever heard, Libby, of Han chauvinism?
I don't think I have.
So Han chauvinism is a concept that was come up in 1950s China by Mao Zedong. It coined initially the idea with Han chauvinism is like they're 90% Han Chinese, and then there's a handful of other ethnic minorities. The Uyghurs are probably the most notable, at least today. The idea was Han chauvinism, or essentially Han privilege, was used as a way for the Communist Party of China to take a whack at Chiang Kai-shek by saying, you're all about the Han people. We in communism, we're all about racial equality. So this idea of Han chauvinism was to stoke grievances in the other minority populations in China. And the effort actually worked, right? The Communist Party takes over. Now, Mao and his terrible policies, like communism, it doesn't know how. So in the Great Leap Forward, they lose 20 million people plus to starvation. So
right.
Mao is actually in trouble by this. So I'm kind of like fast forwarding the history, but Mao is actually by the 1960s potentially losing power. So he uses the idea of Han chauvinism again to get back at some of his political rivals and institutes the Cultural Revolution. And you can use this concept of, oh, you're too Han chauvinistic. You aren't good enough with socialism. Socialism treats the races equally. And again, because white privilege, because Han chauvinism is so amorphous, anyone can be tagged with it. The tactics were to publicly humiliate people, kill, jail people who resisted, and encourage people to make admissions in advance and to attempt to avoid this kind of punishment, like this admission we see here from Katie Slater.
Yeah, I think that's pretty interesting too. And we saw another clip, I think you guys posted it today. It was of a conversation that I think happened back in February in Portland, or at least in Oregon, where there was a teacher talking to other teachers on the call. And she was telling the other teachers that just as teachers who are found guilty of, sexual misconduct with students are fired, teachers that do not embrace and practice critical race theory with their students would be terminated as well. So you have to go along with this Marxist dictate, or else risk losing your job. She actually said to them, evolve or dissolve. That their opinions, their perspective doesn't matter because there's only one way to think. There's only one way to think about racial equality, and it's to say that, the races are not equal, and they're not equal by virtue of the past sins of one and the inherent victimization of the other. It's point. Really a tragedy that we don't have a cultural baseline of equality between all human beings right now.
That's right. I want to give a few quotes, specifically on this Han privilege before we move on to COVID, another thing that came from China, probably. So Mao says, in some places, the relations between nationalities are far from normal. For communists, this is an intolerable situation. We must go to the root and criticize Han privilege ideas which exist to a serious degree among many party members and cadres. To me, this is the same thing. This root of every societal problem is white privilege. Here's another. To correct Han privilege, Chairman Mao advised Han officials to, quote, be more humble, to listen to ethnic minorities' grievances, and to accept their criticism. Have you ever heard listen and believe in this modern dystopia? As soon as the Han reject their Han chauvinism, the ethnic minorities will be willing to narrow their own chauvinism in return. So they can be as racist as they want to be. It's you who must change. And even Deng Xiaoping, one of Mao's right-hand man, said, quote, I believe that Han chauvinism should be eliminated before asking minorities to do the same with their own chauvinisms. Well, that admission and that virtue signaling didn't protect him because he was kicked out of the government twice during the Cultural Revolution. Libby, am I crazy? These parallels to Maoist China seem obvious to me.
I do think it's interesting, and I think that we've seen the founders of some of the more radical movements in the U.S., the more radical leftist movements, have said that they are Marxist. Specifically, there's city council members in Seattle, Kashama Sawant, for one, who has outright said that she's Marxist and that these are her goals. And it's hard to get behind someone whose primary goal is to deconstruct the democracy of the United States without really having any clear understanding of what it's being replaced with.
Excellent point.
Yeah. So, you mentioned the
more
coronavirus. It's hard not to.
Next dystopia topic.
Been the biggest story. Yeah, it's our next dystopian story. So, finally, this week, the entire mainstream news media caught up to the conservative press and GOP lawmakers from about a year ago. And that wild, wacky theory that the coronavirus emerged from a lab in central China has just been accepted as a potential possibility.
So we can talk about it now?
New. We maybe can talk about it now, that it's been admitted to be perhaps just an teensy, tiny bit of a likelihood.
Okay.
Because it turns out, according to the Wall Street Journal this past weekend, they reported that some employees at the lab in central China, in the city where it was, got sick.
We can't say that one though, right?
I don't know what the rules are. So I'm just, I'm not going to curse, and I'm not going to say the C word. No C words on the show. So It turns out, according to the Wall Street Journal, that some researchers at the lab got sick about 2019, and they had similar symptoms. This was reported. It was also reported by The Guardian in March 2020. Sean, you could pull up that article if you like. The Guardian last March got it from the South China Post, and they said that Chinese authorities had identified at least 266 people who contracted the virus last year, meaning 2019 at that point, and who came under medical surveillance. The earliest case, according to The Guardian, was November 17th, which was weeks before, it was recognized by the government and admitted to. So that's interesting. The Guardian didn't talk about the researchers. I think that was the Wall Street Journal. Even though guys like Senator Tom Cotton started asking questions about the potential for the lab leak origin story of the, C word, and Secretary of State Mike Pompeo brought it up, and he started an investigation into the idea. Social media, mainstream media, Democrats, and people who liked to assume perfectly reasonable theories were absolutely absurd because of reasons, declared that it was just fake news. Now everyone's had to do sort of a rapid about face about this. And even the fact checkers that claimed that their view was the only real one and that there could be no other possible perspective, they've had to turn around and say, look what's suddenly become credible now.
So how do they do that? How does the fact checker turn around? Did they say, oops, we pushed the wrong button. Sorry, it was a typo?
No, they don't. They don't do that. In fact, Glenn Kessler, who's the Washington Post top fact checker, who kept a running database on misinformation and false claims that Trump made during his presidency. It's worthwhile to note that he did the same thing for Biden, but only for 100 days, and then said, we're not doing this. We're not keeping this database anymore. But he did do that for Trump. And he counted among the over 30,000 fact checks of Donald Trump were a few fact checks against Trump's supposition that the virus came from a lab. So, Sean, you could pull up this article. This is one of mine from the other day, where I tracked through what Kessler was saying now, which is, hey, look, this is sort of credible now. And he tracked through, and one of his key points that made this a credible theory was that Biden became president. So Biden becomes president, and now it's a little bit more credible. New York Magazine reports on it. Now it's a little more credible than when perhaps The Guardian reported on it, or, when other conservative outlets reported on it last year. So the big switch for Kessler was that left-leaning media outlets started reporting that this might be a thing after Biden became president.
Wow. Okay. Mm-hmm. So Biden's seat in the White House, that changes the science. So there's literally a science button that he sits on in the Oval Office. This is bizarre.
I think he probably does sit on it too, and then he's probably like, "Where did I put that? Where is it?"
What I worry about is just the absolute loss of credibility and institutional thought.
Right, yeah, that's a huge thing. So because what happens is that the fact checkers make these claims. They check the facts and they say, "Hey, that's misleading or false," which is what they said with this lab leak theory. Then the fact checkers' claims get repeated, and their claims about what's right and what's wrong are taken as fact, which means that for every lie that was counted as a fact check, dozens of other lies likely spun off from that, meaning that the fact checkers have turned their opinions into facts, which is essentially propaganda. Social media backed them up. Facebook even suppressed any talk on its platforms of that theory. And they had to reverse that decision last night because it turned out that their woke myopia was actually throttling actual essential discourse, along with whatever else that they were doing. I don't think there's going to be any redemption for those that were falsely maligned for talking about this, tin hat conspiracy theory. The canceled of the COVID conspiracy theorists, they're not going to get a re-airing. They're not going to be heard on that. But the people that made the decisions to say that these are things that cannot be talked about, they were so righteous about it, and they were incorrect in taking that moral authority. They did it because they had the utmost faith in their ideology, and they weaponized it against individuals who didn't share their opinion, and against smaller media outlets and conservative media outlets and senators. Tom Cotton was so maligned. Everything he said was assumed to be
xenophobic, right?
Yeah, and it turned out that was not true at all. These people did not take into consideration at all the likelihood that they could have been wrong. But we can always be wrong, right?
And what about the accountability for being wrong, right? Accountability is the biggest buzzword. So, does Fauci get fired? Even a demerit? Even a harshly worded letter?
There were some lawmakers today calling for his removal, but I don't know. He's been in that position since he poorly handled the AIDS crisis in the 80s.
I know.
He's still there. But when
they have bobblehead
I just
dolls.
want to say that when we stick to a perspective without being open to any questions, we turn away from any hope of ever finding truth.
Mm-hmm.
These fact checkers and the social media companies and CNN and everybody else, they made sure that the sanctity of their ideology was secured. And that was more important to them than any curiosity about what was really going on.
That's a good point.
And you're right that it's crushing our faith in institutions.
It is. And we need that faith. We need that faith in medicine. We need, if people say, take, for example, now this was already existing, right? Vaccines and anti-vaxxers and people that are vaccine hesitant has existed before all of this, faith in the institutions. But wow. If you were a anti-vaxxer who was on the fence that maybe I'm going to get the vaccine, this is a real blow, right? The credibility. It's okay, if Fauci and other the people are lying so much, are you going to do it? So what do we have to maybe help you get out of this? Well, we could always give you better seating at a tournament or a basketball game if you do get the vaccine. So I picked this up from Nikki Klein, who had a tweet, and she had, I don't know if you saw it, Libby, but it was a picture of a sign at a cafe that was laminated, and it said vaccine-only seating, and it said, proof of vaccination required.
I saw that.
And I was so I thought, oh my God, that's crazy. But then instead I thought, Brian, you got to be skeptical. That's one little thing. Why don't you just take a look? So I did. And it just pops this up, a ton of these things. And one of these was from the Miami Heat. And so vaccinated people, so VIPs, vaccinated important people, have new special seatings at sporting events, right? Hey, Libby, do you remember the star-bellied Sneetches?
I sure do.
Yeah, so
they had stars upon theirs.
Stars upon theirs, right? And I wish you would be so cool if you could come up with all the rhymes. Basically, I remember reading this with my mom as a kid, and it was it was essentially an anti-racism book. But so some of these Sneetches, which are these fake creatures, have stars on them, and some don't. And then this inventor tycoon guy comes in, and he's and the stars were the status. So the people with stars, the Sneetches with stars, looked down to the one that didn't. So he was I've got a star belly machine for $3, and you can get a star. So all of the people that were lurked less paid the $3 to get the stars. But then all of the people that already had the stars were but now we're not fancy schmancy anymore. So then he sells them for $10 a star removal machine so they can go unstarred. And is making all this money while everybody's just flipping over. And the whole point was, and the one quote I do remember, until neither the plane nor the star bellies knew which one was that one or who was who, right? That's great. And apparently now we know because Dr. Seuss has been canceled, right? So He's wrong. Sure. A star on your belly really does make you better. Like, no wonder those books were banned. So check this out. Fans from the article, fans with proof from Federal Centers for Disease Control and Prevention that they got their last shot at least 14 days.
Proof from
the CDC. You're probably your
CDC.
Vax card. Yeah.
Like, your little Vax card.
Your special
yeah, you know
what?
It's interesting. Those cards are interesting.
Yeah.
No, go ahead.
Okay. No,
you want me to say? I
go
can
ahead.
say.
Yeah, say it.
Yeah. Well, the White House said that they would absolutely not have a database of vaccines that were given. So they're not. So the cards are just one way, which I do think is better. The White House has gotten some pushback on not keeping a national vaccine registry. And we do have sort of an honor system thing going on. And we do have these businesses making these kind of designations, which I think is, garbage. But I am glad that we do not have a national or statewide vaccine registry.
Totally agree.
I don't. Yeah. So that is a bonus. That is, not a bonus. That is is essential. That is something that is essential that we do not have. It's an interesting
nuance to it. Yeah, I always thought like you'd have to show your Vax card itself, but either way, they get wristbands. And guess what? You get floor seats. The Heat have allocated 2 sections in the lower level for fully vaccinated fans. The team said in a statement, these will be in sections 117 and 118, and the pods of the seat will be separated by only 1 seat. But within those sections, everyone will still have to wear masks.
You get to sit close. Wait. What?
But within those sections, everyone will still have to wear masks.
Wait.
I'm not shitting you.
So you're vaccinated. You're not socially distanced, but you have to wear masks. The mask is just for show at that point, right? No. It's just like an indicator of your compliance.
But you get better seats.
Right?
You get better seats. That's the, yes.
Yeah, okay.
You still have to wear masks.
Well, my gym recently just lifted the mask requirement for people who have been vaccinated. And, I'm pretty sure that people are lying when they go in and say they've been vaccinated. I don't care. I don't care.
I know. I don't either. But it reminds me like this of those little kids thing of what's wrong with this picture. I don't know. Mm-hmm. Is there anything more wrong with that picture? Like I read that article and I just kind of laughed. And I just really don't like this idea that, again, the vaccines are a star-bellied sneetch. I don't like it. But
yeah, I don't like it either. And I don't like this idea that you get better or worse treatment based on what's running through your blood.
Right.
Yeah.
What's running
through
your
blood?
What
else? What else is like? Could there be an illness that perhaps if you have a different kind of illness, you're not allowed to go places? It's just such a different way too of how we've treated other illnesses.
Yeah. Like what about mental illness? I don't want that person with schizoaffective disorder next to me, right? Well, what about a person who's bipolar, right? Well, or someone who's borderline or something. Well, I don't want them next to me. So now I need your mental health history. I want to be in the good guys. Like this was
wacky. An interesting thing too about the ACA that implemented the digital medical records that follow you all over the place. You start to wonder who is going to have access to those records and what they're going to be permitted to do with that information.
Yeah.
It's kind of I as much as it's, easier to go to your doctor and say like, oh, I'll give you my thumbprint and you can go get my records from the other place. There does seem to be something a little peculiar in the safety, the privacy protocols.
Yeah.
In that.
I think it's the closest we've come to a social credit score, and I don't like it. But you were talking about things like blood, but what about chromosomes? You said there was something about like the LGBT takeover of language.
Oh, well, yeah. This has been going on for quite some time. A lot of the fight for women's rights right now is happening entirely in language, and that's where these battle lines are being drawn. There was a case, you might have heard about it. It was in Connecticut a few years ago, still going on. There were 3 young women who brought suit against the state of Connecticut for a violation of their Title IX rights. They were track runners. They were the fastest young women in the state, and that all changed when two biologically male, transgender identified athletes joined the girls' high school competition and, literally ran off with all of the awards. So Chelsea Mitchell was one of these young women. She was a track athlete in Connecticut. Her scholastic track career was totally destroyed by this. She recently wrote an essay, an op-ed in USA Today to talk about her experiences, to talk about what it was like to suddenly be running against, in her words, male body. That these are not her words, but I don't know what we're allowed to say, right? I don't know what the deals are. I get in
Big
trouble
Brother
for this all the time,
watching
so
you.
I'm trying to not get in trouble.
I know.
So she was running against male-bodied students her own age who identified as transgender, and she stated that outright in USA Today. USA Today apparently got some backlash, and so they changed some of her language. I can tell you what they changed. She said that at the time, this was when she was back in school, she ranked the fastest high school female in the 55-meter dash in the state. She knew that she ought to feel confident, that she had a very good chance of winning. Instead, she wrote in USA Today, all I can think about is how my training, everything I've done to maximize my performance might not be enough, simply because there's a runner on the line with an enormous advantage, a male body. This is how it was published. Earlier this week, I read the article. It was rather compelling. USA Today then updated this story to read transgender runner. They cited that the reason for their change was this column has been updated to reflect USA Today's standards and style guidelines. They added further insults, I feel, to Mitchell and her testimony by saying, we regret that hurtful language was used. They made these changes throughout her column. Mitchell knew she was running against an athlete with a male body, and she knew all the advantages that this person had, bone density, muscle mass, having gone through puberty as a male, all that extra testosterone, all of that. Another change in the section, Mitchell said that the Connecticut Interscholastic Athletic Conference, and this is her quote, allows biological males to compete in girls' and women's sports. The revision read that the CIAC allows transgender athletes to compete in girls' and women's sports. Mitchell's lawyer spoke up. She's being represented by the Alliance Defending Freedom, as are the other two young women that are working on the suit. And her, the director of media relations from the ADF said the editors put words into Chelsea's mouth without notice and after the piece was published. And that is exactly what has been done. This is a battle, right? So this young woman wanted a college athletic scholarship. She was up for it. She was doing all of the things that would have earned her that scholarship. And because of what she feels was unfair competition from male-bodied persons her age, as opposed to just female-bodied persons, she was denied those scholarships. The media applauded the biologically male trans-identified runners for their bravery. And when a young woman speaks up to say that she feels that she has been harmed by this policy, her experience is erased in language, and the primacy is given to the people that she feels wronged her. So one life experience is acceptable and allowed to be discussed and even praiseworthy. And the other, from a young woman who feels she's been harmed, is literally edited out of an article that she wrote in order to express what she had experienced. The Women's Liberation Front put together a media guide at a certain point. This was earlier this year. What was it, like in January, I think, to talk about it. And you can find it. Wolf has it. and it gives examples, it gives other ways to use the language that won't erase the experiences of people like Chelsea Mitchell.
Yeah, I think this is narrowing of empathy. When you have enormous amount of empathy.
That's a really interesting way to say it, narrowing of empathy.
Mm-hmm. And that's I generally don't like this, and that's essentially my problem with it.
I don't like it either.
We can go, if you want to go more dystopic, along like the LGBTQ 2+ IAA front. I've got more for you.
There's a lot of letters in there.
There is. So, John, could you pull up this tweet? I call this segment LGBTQ just changes to Q. So if you scroll up, so Vaush, who is definitely a lefty, right? I think he's not a communist. I don't know if he identifies as a socialist, but he's a leftist. That would be fair to say. And so I was scrolling through Twitter the other day, as I usually do, and Vaush's tweet is about the Pride Parade and whether or not like kink or sexual displays ought to be included. So here it goes, and I'll explain the argument. So Vaush says, kink at Pride makes people uncomfortable, and it makes the event less accessible, and accessibility should be a priority. Keep less family-friendly stuff to the many, many after parties and adjacent private venues that every Pride party has. The fact that this is controversial is insane to me, right? Of course, this blows up and people lose their minds. And Vaush adds to a tweet thread, Pride should be a cool, queer-friendly block party that you can attend to meet with organizers and get cute shirts. Everyone should be able to attend. It should be safe and uncontroversial. Dismissing accessibility as sanitization is a really underhanded and disgusting strategy. Now, among the many voices grilling Vaush for his take, as this person, Quartzy2, I don't know what that means, quote, Pride is being visibly queer in public. Because in 1970, that was a crime. It was a crime to be who you are. You could be arrested, thrown in the worst part of prison, lose your job, lose everything, if people knew you were gay. Pride was being out and proud. And then follows up, Pride is not about being family friendly. It's about being visibly queer. In a world that still wants us to go back to a nice little box and not offend anyone, please and thank you. So sorry, F off with that nonsense. Pride is not an effing street fair. And then a furry adds, what do you think the Q stands for? Would pups or furries or the larger BDSM community not count as queer? Queerness is any sexual expression outside the norm. If you can't handle that, maybe you should do some soul searching about what Pride has always been about. Wow.
What do you think? I have absolutely no problem with a wild and wacky Pride parade walking through Greenwich Village. I have no issue with it at all. Also, our Halloween parade is basically a Pride parade in October, but with even crazier costumes. And I think all of that is fine. I mean, I have no intention of taking my kid to the Pride parade. If my kid was gay, I would have no intention of taking the Pride parade. At a certain point, I might say, okay, you're 15, I'll take you and your friends to the Pride parade. But I wouldn't take a younger kid than that.
But you're kind of assuming that this is an adult. When you hear Pride Parade, you're automatically thinking this is adult. This is an adult thing, not a kid's thing.
I automatically think it's an adult thing and not a kid's thing because it's a parade about sexuality.
Right. But if it were if they were going to do a Pride family friendly one, then does that change your calculus?
Not really. I mean, so we're in New York, right? So here I am in New York with my kid, and I do not. Maybe I'm wrong. I'm often wrong, but the
often wrong.
That's
soon.
my kid. I'm always wrong. Today I made banana muffins and I forgot the baking soda to throw the whole thing in.
But remember that's what they called Dr. Noonien Soong. Remember that was the mocking title, Often Wrong?
Right. Oh, that's great. Yeah. Well, anyway, there's so many family-friendly events in this city, and there's so many gay families, and it's fine. It's just totally fine. It's totally normal seeming and fine. But when I hear Pride Parade and when I hear Halloween Parade, I think parade about sex and sexuality and expressing sex and sexuality in a creative and, sort of crazy way. Also, you can't really get across town when these things are happening.
It's funny. I got it. It's some
like
way.
There's just like no way to get across town.
But if they're gonna do whatever,
yeah, I do think that you have a point though about the LGBTQIAP etc. Movement. I do think it is becoming just
the
Q
Q
movement,
right?
So what we need? We need like the QAnon people and the LGBTQ people to just merge and have like just one giant Q. They just need one giant Q movement.
Yeah, right? Maybe if it was more ideologically friendly, people would pipe down, because there might be conservative. I don't know.
Bite down on what?
My weirdest thing about my last comment on it was they talk about, well, this in 1970. Well, okay, I get you. Same way with, like, again, racism in 1970. But heck, it ain't 1970 anymore. And it's
totally not.
Shouldn't we update it? Because, like, it's 14 years
it's
later.
Like these movements' ideologies are, they're combating something that was 70 years ago.
Yeah, I know.
And they're like, because of Donna Reed, these are the stereotypes. And the stereotypes are being remade constantly. We're living through a time when stereotypes are being realigned and realigned and realigned again. And the kids who come after us, they'll realign the stereotypes a different way.
Yep. How do you like your coffee, Dr. Stone?
And there you go.
I think that was Donna Reed's, that was her husband's name. But either way, like 14 years, like now, since we are living in 1984, so 14 years after 1970, things have changed. So they really have. So from Libby and Brian at Dystopia Today, live your life to the fullest. And if the dystopia gets to be a little too much, just always remember you can take your soma. Until next week.
We'll see you back next Thursday.